Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the conversation series at the Carter Centre. My name is Joe Confino. I'm an executive editor at the HuffPost. And before I introduce the subject of this evening and our two panelists, I'm just going to do a couple of housekeeping notes. But first of all, thank you all for coming, and for those on the live feed, thank you for joining us. Can you just all make sure, please, that your cell phones are on mute or silent? But also, we'd love you to tweet about tonight's event, so don't switch them off necessarily if you want to tweet. The hashtag is CarterProject0. In terms of, we're going to have a discussion, but then a question and answer, so if you have any questions, do push those through Twitter. For those who are present, we've got two microphones, one on either side of the room. They're fixed mics, so when we come to the question and answer, if you want to ask a question, please come to the side. Also, I saw that a lot of you had the chance to try on the VR headgear and actually watch one of the films. So it'd be good to get some feedback from you a bit later. But for those who haven't had the opportunity, immediately after this session, there's about 45 minutes where you can come back outside and watch the film. Just to put a bit of context on this evening, I started out as a journalist 35 years ago in London. And at that time, I was on a typewriter. And we had black and white photos, and that was it. That was the only way we could tell the stories in the newspaper in a particular format. And as my career has developed, you know, we've seen increasingly this extraordinary palette of storytelling techniques being developed. So whether it's video, whether it's multimedia, and also this sort of profusion of of platforms, whether it's Facebook, Snapchat, et cetera, et cetera. So this is in some ways a golden age of journalism. And the purpose of journalism is to tell stories and to inform, educate, and hold people to account. And then a few years ago, virtual reality came along, and that got people very excited. And the reason is that always as a journalist, we want to reach people, we want to connect to people, we want our stories to sort of really resonate with people. And sometimes that's very hard in sort of black and white and just with text. And the whole purpose of virtual reality is that you feel you're present, you feel you're actually there, and you can experience it. And the reason people are excited is because that has the possibility to bring about a feeling of empathy. And we all know that the sort of place where we need to see empathy most, in some respects, is in the field of development, which, as we've seen in recent years, you know, we see money sort of draining out of development rather than pouring in, and we see sort of increasingly people focusing on their own worries. So it's really, really important that sort of actually we find new ways of telling stories about extreme poverty, about social justice in the field. So a particular area that we decided to focus on at HuffPost was neglected tropical diseases, and that's because almost they're the hardest stories to voice. And as we saw from the little video now, they're called neglected for a reason, because most people don't really know anything about them, yet they affect 1 billion people, often the poorest in the most difficult to reach places. So we launched Project Zero in January, and that's had a lot of reporting in the field, but the centerpiece of it is 3 virtual reality films, which are actually being launched this week. So the first one's actually gone up on Facebook today. And 2 of those films were filmed earlier this year in Nigeria, and one in the Congo, and they are on river blindness, on yes, emphatically, and sleeping sickness. And the reason we're tonight is, first of all, we got Dr. Frank Richards here, who's one of the world's experts on neglected tropical diseases, based here at the Carter Centre, who has sort of been doing extraordinary work. And so it's about finding out really a bit more about neglected tropical diseases, but also about being in the field and about the impact the films have had on you. And then Ben Moran, who is our award-winning filmmaker who we commissioned to do these 3 films, and so is going to be able to talk about, you know, how the medium is developed and how effective it can be. So without further ado, Frank, we have a mixed audience tonight. Some are going to be experts, some are going to know less. But just give us a bit of context about, you know, we saw briefly, yes, it's 1 billion people. We know it affects people in real poverty. But tell us a bit about what neglected tropical diseases are, why it's so important we focus on them.
Well, I think, welcome, and thanks for coming, everyone, tonight. I think it's really interesting to think that there are 1.5 billion people who are afflicted by neglected tropical diseases, and there are 1.5 billion people who live on less than $1 a day. And the overlap is almost precise in that there is a true linkage between poverty and these conditions. So they're diseases of neglected people in the sense that this 1/5 of humanity is living on the fringes. Fringes economically, fringes socially, politically, and the conditions of their lives, because of the poverty, makes them exposed to these neglected, parasitic, and bacterial, in some case fungal. There are 18 of them. And it is the environmental conditions, the poor nutrition, the poor water, the exposure to bites by insects, all of these things combine. And the neglected tropical diseases generally do not kill, they maim. They slowly drain your energy, they stigmatize, they make you even further an outcast than you are already, being part of the bottom billion. And you enter into a malicious cycle of poverty, infection, more poverty, more infection. And a lot of what you saw in these, the films, I think you start to grasp how terrible. I like to call some of these neglected tropical diseases horror story diseases. I mean, just the maiming, just the desperation of people with these conditions, how they influence their kids, their wives, and husbands, and the amount of money that is spent in a family that doesn't have much money anyway to try desperately to seek a cure is further catastrophe. So it's really an important problem. But the other thing I'll say is that these conditions are not very easy to explain. They're not very easy to message. The life
Or to pronounce.
Or to lymphatic filariasis, yeah, the unpronounceable diseases. And so one really needs to have professionals like yourselves to think about how do you really message the neglected tropical diseases, and how do you really message the opportunity that we have to do something about them. And I think it's, I hope we talk more about that tonight, because what you're doing is, I think, very, very important from a number of different angles, and it's nice to explore that.
So let us explore that a little bit, because how important is it that these things are discussed in a public forum? So, I mean, most of your work is going to be working with people who are influencers, whether it's government bodies, whether it's experts. How important is it that there's a general understanding of them?
Well, that was a question I was going to ask you, but I
got in there first.
But I think you know, there is an importance in messaging from a number of different levels. First of all, I think a lot when I look at 3D, virtual reality, globes. How can we communicate more with the people in the community suffering from the neglected tropical diseases? Because so often people's conceptualization of what you saw was a hex, witchcraft, something they did wrong. And trying to communicate in the midst of the environment that I just described, so that you can enlist communities and community members as your partners in this, is a very important and a big challenge. And so I'm always looking at the new technology and wondering about that. On the complete opposite spectrum, for river blindness, onchocerciasis, if it had not been for an article in the Houston Chronicle, print media, a philanthropist, a high net worth individual, would not have said, what, we have this opportunity to do something about this forgotten disease and nobody's investing, thinking as entrepreneurs do, this is an opportunity. He only heard about it from a wonderful article that with photographs and really concise reporting got him to ultimately invest probably up to $50 million of his own money to really kickstart a program that without that seminal investment wouldn't have happened. So here's a range, and there's everything in between from just this audience understanding and becoming committed and and thinking about what's going on and what they might be able to do to contribute. So there's a whole range.
Ben.
If I can add something to that as well, some of my colleagues, one I'm thinking of in particular, who created the United Nations Virtual Reality section, specifically to create content not just for consumers and the general public, but to show them at Davos, to show them at the United Nations General Assembly in September, to show them to decision makers so they're better informed and they can kind of feel more connected to these policies that they're negotiating or that they're discussing. So it actually directly relates, and I think there is a strategy to get more decision makers to watch these films and to understand these stories.
Yes. And if you were to ask me that question, one of the things for me is picking on the topics that are at the edge of society, because I think there's so much emphasis on going for the big numbers in terms of readership or the things that are currently in vogue, and everyone piles in. And for me, I'm more interested in the topics that are forgotten, and knowing full well that they're very difficult stories to tell, that they will never get the big numbers. That when you see the top 100 stories, they might not be in that, but actually there's a way of telling those stories that exactly what Ben says. It's like throwing a pebble in the water. You never know where the ripples affect, and you never know what impact you have. But it's knowing that actually that these are people who have no voice. And actually, if we don't give them the voice, their stories don't get told. Frank, tell us a little bit about Nigeria, because obviously we came to the Carter Center. You said you'd love to work with us. You took us to Nigeria. Why there?
Well, I've been working in Nigeria since 1992 and had a wonderful experience working with Nigerians dedicated to improving the lives of their countrymen and of the country in general, in terms of the great number of people exposed to neglected tropical disease in Nigeria. It's the largest country in Africa, and the population being so large, proportionally speaking, the absolute numbers of people suffering from NTDs is greatest on the continent of Africa in Nigeria. We have seen films on lymphatic filariasis tonight. That's the one that causes elephantiasis. The number one country in the world suffering in terms of population is India, but Nigeria is second. And in terms of river blindness, the number one country in the world with people suffering from river blindness, onchocerciasis, is Nigeria. So we believe very strongly here in the Carter in assisting countries in these efforts that we ought to try and think about the problem where the problem is biggest, because by definition it will usually take longest to solve the challenge there. We've had, as I said, a very long-standing relationship, successful relationship in Nigeria. The Carter Center's flagship program is against guinea worm. This is the parasitic disease that emerges generally from your leg. It's a worm that's about a meter long that slowly has to be extracted from a stick, transmitted by unclean drinking water. And the Carter Center is leading an eradication program for guinea worm. And Nigeria, when the campaign began, was the country most afflicted with guinea worm. And to give an example of going to the hard places first, Nigeria has successfully eradicated guinea worm and is a great success story. And so I for one, am hoping to see additional success stories in our work in Nigeria with the Nigerian government and people in ultimately getting rid of lymphatic filariasis and river blindness.
And one of the things that's interesting, I think, you personally, is not saying, let's try and ameliorate it, let's not reduce, but you said, let's go for elimination.
This is Project Zero.
Yeah. So tell us, was that brave or stupid, looking back at it?
A little of both, I think. I think you have to be aspirational to the point of near insanity to go after zero. But the fact of the matter is, it's been done with smallpox, and that has become our touchstone. The first Vice President of Health of the Carter Center and our first CEO of the Carter Center, Dr. William Fagey, and Vice President Dr. Donald Hopkins are what we call smallpox warriors. They were the graduates of the smallpox eradication campaign, the one and only time human beings have purposefully eliminated or eradicated an affliction of humankind. And I think once you drink that soup, you never stop. And what's very interesting is that it is so electrifying and engaging to generation after generation of public health practitioners that this is the pinnacle of the efforts. It represents a supreme accomplishment and ultimate closure and the important element of equity, because everyone comes along for the eradication ride. So I do think that it does border on insanity, and I do believe we will continue to try and often fail, but we're never going to stop aspiring to this. And in this particular case, I think we have a great opportunity to literally eradicate both of these conditions that you saw in those videos today, such that people would never, ever, generation after generation, here to eternity, have to suffer from what we saw on those films today. And that's a virtuous thing to do, in my opinion, and we ought to try for it.
Okay, and before we go to Ben, well, everyone else is insane with you, so that's good. What was your experience of making the films with Ben? As a new form of filmmaking, and also, what you feel the impact of virtual reality can be.
I don't know if you got a load of some of the pictures that were being shown there, but if you can imagine every morning bright, like before the restaurant even opens up, and where we were staying in Owerri, eating a piece of bread and then loading up several pickup trucks full of heavy equipment, and then going out to the field for a day of filming that would include this apparatus that would film not just 360 degrees, but an actual globe up and down to the zenith, down to the floor. And when you're filming, of course, if everybody's in the picture, then you can't have technicians standing around. They'll be in there. So once they say, okay, action, this sort of hit the, whatever that thing is you guys hit. Yeah. And then everybody runs away and you're just sort of left there. And Ben will be hiding behind a tree, pointing to you, then you start talking to no one. It's sort of the scene. Then they'll pick up, a little box and open it up and put together a drone and start flying this drone around. I think you may have noticed some scenes where it's like zooming in and zooming out. There's a drone flying through the air, and then they put together a walking black studio box. I thought it was usually a green screen. I said, is it green or whatever you call it? But and then you get in tropical Africa, you're sweating in this box while they're filming you with this 360-degree thing, and they zip it up. I mean, it's a tent. And the whole thing zips up, and you're just talking, and they're talking from the outside. It was like bizarre. Anyway, it was a very bizarre experience.
But incredibly enjoyable.
Oh, yes. I like bizarre experiences. That's fine.
Ben, let's talk about, because the whole point of virtual reality is this idea that you feel you're there because it is by its nature the globe.
You don't feel you're there when you zip you up in a black tent.
But when you're watching it.
Yeah, when you're watching it.
When you're watching. So tell us about the impact you see VR having, and whether it's hyped up, whether you genuinely think this is a new medium that can have an impact.
So what's special about VR, I think for many of you probably it's the first time that you've seen it in a headset. It's most of the time that we do these showings, it's the first time that people have seen it because it's very new. But what's special about it is that you expand your field of view from just the size of the rectangle that is TV or the video that you see online to 360. And what you're doing with that is you're giving the viewer agency. You let them view what you think is the most important thing, which is the subject that you're, maybe it's going to be Frank speaking to the camera, or it's going to be one of the victims of these diseases that we filmed. But they also can turn around and look at something else. They can look at the family, they can look at the house. That creates a degree of chaos for filmmaking. You don't necessarily have full control. In a really crowded African village where there's kids running around, it can be really difficult to film in that situation. But at the same time, I think it allows people to have that sense of presence that you described earlier. And that's kind of what you're going for when you film in 360 and in VR. You're trying to create this sense of presence. That's the ultimate goal, to allow people to be completely immersed in the film as possible. And that can be really hard. And I think that it does create the possibility, though, for additional understanding, additional empathy, as you brought up. And there is some proof that this is actually happening. I mean, there's some studies that have been done in Stanford, for instance, that VR helps people understand racism, helps people understand what it's like to be a homeless person. And they're studying this, they're trying to actually measure the impacts of VR in your understanding of these issues. So I think in going to the field in Africa and creating these films, the goal is to try to help people understand what is a neglected disease, what is something that is very far away from them, that is not going to impact them individually, but hopefully they'll care about it with these films.
Is it something that, so, some people will say it's elitist, so you have to have, to view it in a really positive way, you have to have one of those headsets, they're expensive. Normally what takes off is mass media, where things are freely available, is when they get real traction. Is this something that you think will take off, or is it a niche? And if it is a niche, who should it be aimed at? Should it be aimed at the general public? Should it be aimed at decision makers? Who would benefit most from it?
So I think
Bill Gates will love it.
Yeah, right.
Guarantee you.
My own there's a range of opinions, I think, on that question. I personally believe that it is a temporary technology. I think that we're in a window where there's a lot of hype. There's billions of dollars being invested into VR right now, mostly for the gaming industry or something, or Steven Spielberg is even making a video in VR. But it's just bulky. I mean, you've seen the headsets that you wear. Most people are never going to own that. And I think that the next generation that people are looking for is something that's a lightweight glasses that you can wear. Then the next generation would be augmented reality, which is basically projecting a story into your natural environment. So you can walk around and you can actually see President Carter here, for instance, even though he's not physically here, as an example. So I think, but we need to go through this level of technology in order to get to the next level itself. But there is a lot of interest and excitement about even this stage where we're at.
So given this stage, where should we be aiming these films? So we've got these 3 films now. We spent a lot of money, a lot of Gates Foundation money to create them. What would your advice be? Should it be aimed at the decision makers? Are we trying to get the general public interested? Is it a bit of both? What is the purpose?
As a filmmaker, I primarily think the role of these films is to educate, and I think that's both the general public and decision makers. And I think that HuffPost is actually very good at, reaching a very wide audience, consumers who maybe have never heard of elephantiasis, and I think that's really important to do. At the same time, as we were talking about before, it's very important to help people understand how, for instance, prevalent elephantiasis is, and for decision makers to get that message as well. So I think it's a mixture of both.
And Frank? Yeah.
I would agree with decision makers. I think in particular, in this case, I would love to see this in Nigeria. I mean, I'd love to see decision makers see this at the Ministry of Health or in other positions, so that you can have further advocacy. We always see the technical people, the folks in the ministry who are our colleagues working on this, and they love it when we come to Abuja or go to the States, because our going to see the governor or the minister of health allows us to promote their efforts, and so they find, the technical people with whom we work find it very useful to go and see the political people, if you will, the decision makers. But I guess one difference that I see is, rather than educate, I would use the word persuade. I really wonder, look for technologies with increasing power to persuade, which is the word persuasion to me is more free will, embracing, I've thought about it, and I'm in. And so I'm very sort of interested in looking, for example, after just having experience today, how important it is for the person you're looking at to walk off to your left and sort of leaving, and you've got to follow them around as they move, and how that just that active participation might be more persuasive from, again, virtual reality, and you're actually there rather than watching a TV screen. It's interesting.
I just thought of a funny story. Some of you maybe have been to Nigeria, and when you're in parts of Nigeria, you have a security detail. You don't have a choice. And the security detail that was there with us was never, we couldn't film them, obviously, but they had never seen elephant. They had heard about it. They had never seen up close elephantiasis, and they were terrified. And I think that, in a way, and they were adamant about taking their medication after it, and they immediately were calling their family, saying, absolutely, sleep under a mosquito net, and you do not want this disease. And I think a lot of the potential for these films also is to be shown to the Nigerian general public, so they can actually understand how horrible these disfigurements are in a way, and just viscerally decide to try to avoid it.
And Frank, coming back to that, so when you're going around and you're trying to persuade people, what is the gap? So you imagine that even that people in the country would be aware of this and understand, as you're saying, there is a gap of knowledge. But I mean, what connects people to an issue like that, to the point where they move from saying, yes, I'm aware of it, but it's not important, to, yes, I'm aware of it, I recognize its importance, and I want to do something? What's the journey that they have to go through to move from one to the other?
Well, I think it has been helpful, but one has to be careful in doing this, because you don't want to seem as though you're parading people. But I know, and I have some colleagues here, Charles McKenzie, for example, works a lot in Tanzania, and has found it very useful to enlist or persuade people who have these terrible deformed legs that you saw to be a part of the campaign to get people to take their medicine in the mass drug administration programs with these donated medicines. It's important to recognize that the interventions are safe and effective tablets that are being donated In this case, by Merck and by GlaxoSmithKline. It's another company called Eisai donating another medicine. These are combination medicines, pharmaceutical companies coming and cooperating with each other, donating these medicines. For lymphatic filariasis in 2016, we're talking about almost 600 million people being treated. And overall, when you take the main neglected tropical diseases that can be treated by this strategy, well over 1 billion treatments. So we're talking about a big effort. But these tablets are safe and effective, but people have to take them. People have to agree to take them, and a lot of people don't feel ill. And a lot of people don't like to take medicines unless they're persuaded that this is something they should take. So it's a long answer to say that I think seeing a face and with a leg and the suffering and folks saying you don't want to wind up blind, you don't want to wind up disabled with this leg, has been a useful thing in campaigns to get people to take the medicine so that they might not have the same condition. And also, I think it's important to recognize that these medicines are very important for breaking the transmission cycle, because the transmission cycle is mandatory to go through an insect vector. And these parasites, they're worms. They don't live in the environment. They don't live in the mosquitoes and flies. They live in people, and they're transmitted by mosquitoes and flies. And if people take the treatment, the parasites will ultimately go away. You can stop the treatment and be done with it, and that's the idea. But there has to be an effective, persuasive communication campaign to get people to do that. So having smart people like you thinking about that, it's not just the decision makers and the high net worth individuals, it's how do we communicate to the bottom billion that is the target, if you will, should be the beneficiaries of this donation.
Okay, but before we throw it open, obviously you went with Frank to Nigeria, but also you went to the Congo with DNDi and focusing on sleeping sickness, which again is close to eradication. And there's sort of this big push now to sort of do the final phase. Tell us a little bit about that experience and what you learned from that.
About filming in the Congo, or
Congo,
okay.
and yes, and about what you experienced in the Congo.
We filmed the third film in the series, Elephantiasis, river blindness, and sleeping sickness. That's the third film. That's a very rare disease right now. It's found in very remote parts of the Congo and parts of East Africa, and it is truly a really horrific disease that used to affect hundreds of thousands of people in the early 20th century. In parts of Central Africa, something like 40% of all deaths were caused by sleeping sickness. And it's just it's a degenerative brain, it's a parasite that causes degenerative brain condition that you just go into a coma basically and die after a year or so. So at this point, though, there's been a campaign for the past 30 years from the Congolese government that's been quite successful. And the remaining cases are in very remote areas. And so the trip involved taking motorcycles, taking cars on day-long trips, going down the Congo River for hours in a dugout canoe. It was very difficult, and we, just to find those areas where sleeping sickness is present. And the problem is with sleeping sickness in general is, even how it was difficult for us to get to those areas, that's not where sleeping sickness is generally found. It's even further into the bush. So from a medical perspective, as far as I understand, it's truly making that last step to reaching those people where the remaining victims are, is the goal.
What's your experience of professionals in the field? So not just the Dr. Frank Richards, but the village health teams, the sort of volunteer health workers in villages, the people who are making those trips, who are often working without pay to get pills delivered. From your experience, what did you make of all that?
We really worked with some of the volunteers that I think were trained by the Carter Center in Nigeria that were part of your team in the Ministry of Health. and the volunteers in the Congo as well were just really incredible. They're working for some, they're literally volunteers. Sometimes they get a small, stipend to cover some of their expenses. And they're the ones that are actually doing most of the work, implementing, reaching everyone, going door to door, which you saw, I think, in the Elephantiasis. There's Kate, one of the characters we filmed. She's going door to door. She's not just giving people medicine, but she's creating that trust that Frank was talking about, that helping to convince people that this is very important and that you can trust the program that is. I mean, can you imagine someone showing up at the door at your house and saying you need to swallow these pills? It's insane. But that's how they do it, and it's important. So.
But I think it's important to recognize that you're now reaching the third and the fourth generation that has experienced these kinds of campaigns. There is a level of trust. When it first started, there wasn't that level of trust. There's also a pretty evident benefit to these medicines. They're effective against intestinal worms, and then you go and you pass these intestinal worms, and it's like, that's great. People generally don't like to have worms. There's some cultures that do, by the way, but people generally don't. The ivermectin, Mectizan, is effective against scabies. It's effective against lice. So people have less itching. They sleep better. They feel better. So the medicines begin to sell themselves. It's sort of like, where's my medicine? I mean, if the medicine hasn't come, in a given year. So then you start seeing a grassroots swell of demand for a service from the Ministry of Health. And I think that's a healthy thing too, and that, why hasn't this service come? And in organizing to, at the community level, for people to distribute these safe and effective medicines. So there's a lot of community development and empowerment that goes along with this that's actually quite exciting, and you hope will spill over to other things like use of bed nets, or hopefully the scientists will continue to give us more miracle medicines like these, safe and effective at little or no cost, and then you can use this logistical system that's been constructed and that people are used to and trust to do other things. So I tell the upstream scientists, keep coming up with new ideas, because if we get rid of river blindness and if we get rid of lymphatic filariasis, the system will start to break down if you don't need the medicines anymore. And the question is, how can we continue to use what we've built and the community development and trust that we've engendered?
Great. I wanted to throw it out to the audience. Two things. One is questions, but the other is for anyone who has seen the film, just to give us some feedback about what the experience was like if it's the first time you've done that. There are two microphones, one over there, one over there. So what I would say is, please don't be shy. Because if you don't ask questions, don't get feedback, then I'll have to ask lots more questions, which I'm very happy to do because it's my profession. But I would love to. I'd love to get some feedback. So if someone could be brave enough to stand up and just go to the mic and either ask a question or just give some feedback, that'd be great. Yes, thank you. God bless you. And if you, when you ask a question, and if you're anyone else, please stand up and go to the microphone and wait there. If you can just tell us what your name is and where you're from, that would be great. And please, let's get a couple more people up and at the mics. Yes, thank you.
Hi, I'm Margaret Ann Staten, and I'm from Atlanta since 1992, originally from North Carolina. But I saw the film, and it was very disturbing because it was the first time I ever seen an elephant leg or lymph nodes or whatever it's called. And I wasn't aware of the river blindness either. So looking at that, I wonder if the medicine that they take, if it would ever reverse the river blindness.
So one of the stories that my a colleague of mine, Dr. Dave Addis, who's worked a lot in lymphatic filariasis, likes to tell is a woman in Haiti who had elephantiasis, who, after taking the medicine that we've discussed for several years, actually threw them the 4th year into Dave's face and said, "These are not working." David was moved from that experience to begin what we call the second leg of the lymphatic filariasis program, excuse the pun. The first is to prevent people from ever getting that condition, but the second leg of the program is to try and offer hope to people like that woman who threw the medicines back and said, "These aren't helping," at Dave. And essentially, the effort is to try and prevent the progression of the swelling, to keep the leg clean so it doesn't get infected, and especially to reduce the smell, because these legs can smell really terrible and become even more socially isolating. But the unfortunate thing to say is that there's really no way, once you get to that advanced stage that you saw, to reverse that condition to get back to a normal leg. And that's really tough. That's really tough for me. And it ought to be really tough for anybody looking at that, because you come away from looking at the people that were the subjects of these films in virtual reality, coming away with great compassion and empathy and wanting to hear that they can be fixed, they can be cured. While you can take all sorts of solace and all sorts of good feelings perhaps from the fact that no generations of kids will go through that suffering again, it still leaves you with an empty feeling about the depression that's so obvious from the stories and the people that you met, and how their lives are always going to be a big challenge. So that's a long answer for, unfortunately, the medicines, once you reach that advanced stage, are going to do very little. The good news is, in earlier stages, especially for river blindness, you can reverse the eye disease, and there's lots of evidence that you can also arrest and prevent the progression of someone from going to those advanced elephantiasis stages that you saw.
Okay.
One
Yeah.
more quick question.
Yes. Can I just ask you a question first? We'll tag each other. So my question to you before you ask anything else is, what was your experience of actually seeing the film? So how did you feel about having that sense of being in that virtual reality?
Well, it was like, is there anything that I could do to help? Exactly. And it was just kind of devastating to know that and to be aware, and especially to see it in 3D. It was a real eye opener.
Okay. And did you want to ask anything else, and then we'll...
Yeah. The medicine you said is it's delivered yearly. So are they taking one pill a year, or is that how it goes?
It's a combination of 2 medicines, and there'll be one large tablet, which is a medicine we call albendazole, and in this case in Africa there'll be up to 4 small white tablets, which are the mectizan tablets. So if you can imagine, you would be taking...
That's once a year, is it?
Once a year. And so you would imagine you would be taking up to 5 tablets. Now, in the river blindness scenario, you're only taking one of those medicines called mectizan, and you may take that once or twice per year, depending on the program.
Okay.
Thank
let's
you.
have... so you were going to ask questions. If you want to...
Twice, I mean every 6 months.
Every 6 months. Thank you. Again, if you can just tell us your name and where you're from.
Certainly. My name is Dave Hutton. I live here in Atlanta, but between 1995 and 2000, I lived and worked in Nigeria. We lived in the southern part where the oil industry resides. And our companies, quite a few of the oil companies, invested heavily in social programs. But this is not one that I heard much about from my oil company. I had heard of it before. And I wondered, in lieu of how much the Gates Foundation is involved and the other pharmaceuticals, how much funding you get from the oil companies that are in Nigeria itself. By the silence, yeah. It's an interesting aspect because we seem to be focusing very centrally at the oil companies. In the Port Harcourt area where I was, we drilled water wells and we produced, we gave them electricity and we built roads because the government wouldn't do anything for them. And so the villagers would come to the oil companies and basically as their second source of income and ask us to do things. And it does disappoint me that we hadn't gone that far.
So,
In fairness, I think in the 1990s we had some funding from one of the oil companies. And the oil companies are also, as I understand it, have agreements with the government for, as you mentioned, social development programs, and those funds are channeled directly to states. So I'm speaking just in terms of funding that the Carter Center enjoys or that I'm aware directly goes to river blindness or lymphatic filariasis prevention through the Ministry of Health. I'm unaware of those.
And so did you watch one of the films at all?
Yes, I watched both of them.
So tell me what your sense of him was.
I'd seen and heard of both illnesses before, but the actual being present, almost you would say, being present in that village did bring it more to the forefront of my mind anyway.
Okay, thank you. I haven't seen, yes, wonderful, thank you. Again, just your name and where you're from.
Yeah. Hi, is it working? Yeah,
Yes.
it is. So my name is Hiba, I'm from Tunisia, North Africa, I don't know if people know, sometimes I get the question. So I watched both videos before you, and I can start with the impression that the videos gave me and then I can ask the questions. So I heard of the river blindness before, but I've never heard of the elephantiasis. So yeah, it was really shocking for me, especially that I'm from Africa, but I've never ever heard of it. And it's happening in Africa, so it's kind of disturbing for me not to be aware of this, especially that I'm a dentist by training and I'm doing my master's of public health here, so it was very, very disturbing not to know about that. And my question is, so when you say that there is a possibility to eradicate such diseases, and we know that they are transmitted by flies and insects and all that. So this also includes cleaning waters, but we know that in these countries there is a big quantity of water, and I'm not sure how involved the government is, how much money they have, or how much are they willing to collaborate with such projects and all that. How do you exactly see eradicating these diseases, only relying on medication, or what needs to happen exactly, like from a pragmatic point of view? And thank you.
So first, as I mentioned, I think it's important to recognize that there are no what we call animal reservoirs. There's no environmental reservoir. This is essentially an infection of human beings. And it's the transmission from person to person is by these vectors, but it's really a very weak transmission cycle. The thing to remember is that these are worms, they're adult male and female worms. They produce baby worms that we call microfilaria, and these baby worms can't grow up to become adult male and female worms unless they take a trip out of the body through a fly or a mosquito and come back. It's a crazy reproductive system that is not difficult to break. And you can use vector control, as you might think. And as a matter of fact, the malaria program with bed nets or house spraying is attacking the exact same mosquitoes that transmit elephantiasis. So already we have an impact, and adding these medicines to prevent the mosquitoes from getting infected is extremely effective. And the lymphatic filariasis program globally is doing very well. Right now, 20 countries have stopped their mass treatment program globally, and approximately 300 to 400 million people no longer have to take treatment for it. So this is really working. In river blindness, it's a tougher parasite. The worm is a bit tougher, but still everything I mentioned is important. You can do vector control, you can do the mass treatment, and 4 countries in the Americas have now been verified as free. So I'm pretty convinced that we have proof of concept that this can be done. And we have the tools that we need, and we just need to have the fortitude and the persuasion to decision makers that we ought to go for this and take it to a fitting end, which is people don't suffer from these things again.
One additional question. Is there any risk for shortage for the medication? Because it's a lot of people. So.
Right.
And it's basically relying on
I can tell you a
donations.
great story of a sister program called the trachoma program that also uses mass drug administration with a medicine called zithromycin that's produced in Puerto Rico. And after, was it Irma? No. Maria went through, all the power's off, so no production's happening. And yes, there is a severe global shortage such that the Mass Drug Administration in 2017 has been arrested until the power gets back up again. So there is always the risk of a shortage through catastrophe like this.
Okay, can I just pick up on, so you described the films as that film is disturbing. So is that disturbing in a positive way, or disturbing as like, don't you ever show me anything like that again? In the sense of, if I'd shown you an article on this, as opposed to, or just a normal video, as opposed to that experience, did that make any difference for you?
I definitely think that the VR is much more impactful, because I can still remember how one of the victims was saying that it was hard for him not to see his kids growing up. Like, he remembers seeing them when they were born, but he cannot see them now, and he cannot see how his wife is changing. And these kind of sentences, maybe if you read them, you can forget them. But like when I saw him saying that, I cannot forget. So I definitely think it was very impactful, at least on me. I don't think I can forget that.
Okay, thank you. I can also say, there's some other creative, I really like the animation. As you can see, explaining these life cycles is complicated, and having those kinds of diagrammatic, it's much more difficult in the village with a flip chart and trying to keep people's interest in your showing. I'm dying to figure out how some of this technology can be used in a better way as more industries launch microsatellites and more people have smartphones, and you can just, and now I see the little goggles that you can have on your smart. So I'm just looking forward to getting down to the village and figuring out how we can work like there. I'm looking forward for you guys to be your magicians down at
Sounds like a joint application to the Gates Foundation coming up. Yes, sir.
George Howard. For the last year, I've lived in Atlanta. I've been going in and out of the Congo since 1970, regularly since 90. And so I've seen the kinds of things that those videos showed. it's a little disconcerting when you're seeing it from up above and flying down into it. But I thought it was great. People experience the one-dimensional into the multi-dimensional, and it takes you right into it. So thank you for your work in the video, in the films. My question is, the frontline people are volunteers or very low-paid people who go where the roads end, and then they continue into the villages. What have you learned in your experience to sustain that movement of people to continue to do what they do day after day after day? They're called to it, but how do you sustain it?
Well, I often describe the work as not what you would need to look at as a full-time job. We pay very close attention to the ratios that the distributors have and think about what might be reasonable for someone who has a life, has other things to do. And if you can imagine having under your responsibility 20 households with 5 or 6 people per household, so you're talking about 100 to 120 people, but 20 households to visit, and you know how long it would take you to do that in your off hours when to go and with a poll measure how high people are and provide them with tablets. These are your family, your friends, your neighbors who appreciate the service. Often we see in kind, I'll take care of your kids, I know you have to do this, so I'll take care of your kids while you're doing this, etc. And over the years, you start also to develop people who've done it, and then they take a couple of years off, and then they come back. Because, well, I can't do it this year, but then you start developing a trained cadre of folks, but I can't do it this year, but, you know, Kwame can do it, or, you know, Keisha can do it, or someone else can do it, because she did it 2 years ago, and I talked to her, and she's going to be able to do it this year. You start seeing that ability to call on others who've done it, so that you have to be really careful with looking at attrition rates, because it's not necessarily attrition. It's like, well, you know, I can't do it this year, but I'm dedicated to this. Next year I'll find a way, but something's up this year. So I think you need to kind of look at it in that way. Also in terms of supervisors of these volunteers, because we have to report how the tablets are used and the numbers of people who are treated. If you can imagine everyone has a notebook recording their 25 villages, somebody's going to have to do the roll-up. And if there's something that I'm really anxious for Bill Gates or somebody to figure out is how to reduce the work. If you're a supervisor and you have 5 different distributors, and now you have to do 5 times 100, you know, and 20 people, and summarize that in a summary form, with people asking for more and more concise information on high, like we want to know how many girls you treated, we want to know how many boys you treated, how many kids you treated. That starts to be a really complicated demand. And it's that demand that I worry about much more than the 120 people you have to treat. On those folks who have to do the roll-up and the data that we have to rely on, we're seeing more and more that those data coming up through the system are unreliable because of the demands for precision in what you want to know. Other than I treated, you know, we treated 10,000, we were supposed to treat 10,000 people and we treated 8,000 people, fine. But if you want to break that down on age and gender, that becomes a big task. And that's what I spend my nights up about worrying about in the system.
I'm afraid we're we're running out of time now, so we've got to stop there. One of the things, I met Frank in January. I interviewed him. I came here to interview President Carter and Frank, and you know, to have 2 extraordinary professionals in different fields working together was joyous, because Frank, as you see, just knows everything and has this extraordinary passion and dedication, and Ben also, you know, it's you know, you can spend your life going and making money in the advertising world or making movies, but the dedication of someone who is, prepared to go out in the field and build these and tell stories about people that don't normally get told. That not only gives them respect, but actually allows their voice to be heard, which is what journalism should be all about. So just to thank you both. So did you want to say something? The microphone is just at the back. We'll have to be very brief, though. And then is everyone okay for 2 more minutes? Great, thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, the moderator. My name is Innocent Iwejo. I am from the Consulate General of the Federal Republic of Nigeria. Mine is not a question, just to express appreciation to the panelists first for the insightful analysis of the outcome of the film, the virtual reality. I want to thank most importantly the video makers, the researchers who went to Nigeria for this. I want to most importantly also thank the Carter Center for all the collaborations all these years. Mine is not, I don't need to rely on the film because I've seen these things coming from Nigeria and of course from Imo State, one of the states you went. I don't need to see the films to see an instance of Elephantiasis sufferer or river blindness. The fact is that the pride or the prestige of a tick population comes with its own challenges. One of the challenges of a tick population, especially coming from Africa, is that of poverty. And of course, most of these people, if you check the film very well and the environment, the setting, you would have seen that these people that suffer from these diseases are people that live predominantly in the rural areas where they have less access to good water and environment. So the mosquitoes that are vectors that carry these diseases are more prevalent in these areas. And so I would think that this video is kind of an exposition of what is happening in that environment. I appreciate the technology too that was very incisive and brought out the realities of how people suffer in that location. And I think the whole world, and as we gather here today, some people have empathized. It is really going to be very important for some donor agencies, the Carter Center, the Bigger Foundation, and those who have been partners with our country to do further things to see what it can do to assist the people that are suffering from these kind of diseases. It is quite unfortunate that such diseases are not yet totally eradicated in some parts of the world, Africa, maybe Nigeria specifically now. I want to tell you that the federal government of Nigeria, the Ministry of Health, has done as much as eradicating some diseases like such as polio and of course the polio and which other one here? Guinea worm, of course, recently, and we have zero tolerance in those areas now. So the enormity of elephantiasis is such that the country may not be able to do it alone. So we call on the world to come to assist Nigeria in this area, because those people living in these areas are also human beings like you and I. We believe that while the federal government is doing all it could to eradicate these diseases, there is need for the Carter Center to step up the assistance, especially in the area of drugs, because already developed elephantiasis may not be reversible. But those that are not yet infected can be prevented if they given the appropriate drugs so that they cannot be transmittable. Once again, I thank you for the audience. I thank you for the filmmakers for the analysis. I thank the Carter Center. I thank every one of you on behalf of the federal government of Nigeria. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Innocent. Thank you. Yeah, so just to close, it's, as I said, just to thank Ben, to thank Frank for joining us, to thank you for coming, because without an audience, we would be talking to ourselves. So thank you for that, but especially just a final appreciation for the Carter Center, because when we first talked to them about the fact that we were making these virtual reality films, they sort of jumped at it, said, you know, we would love to be part of this experiment. They've been extraordinarily helpful and supportive, and Frank and everyone else, Emily gave enormous amounts of time to make this happen, and all the difficulties of getting out in the field and making this happen. So thank you, the Carter Center, for all that. And also just a reminder that there's at the back, if you don't want to wear the headsets, there's that wonderful globe at the back where you can see the films, but also for the next 30 to 40 minutes, for those who didn't watch the films, you can use the headsets outside. So if we can just thank Frank and Ben, that'd be wonderful. Thank you.